Okay, I'm back again today, so soon, for another video on books that fall under a certain category. Today's video being about technology and tech giants, and this includes both histories of certain kind of ubiquitous companies, fictional books, and non-fictional books that make commentary about technology, so things like social media, and just a few kind of like random pieces in between. It's a collection of books that I've read over quite a wide period of time, but I think they all kind of fall under this category, and it might be interesting to kind of look at them all together. I'm going to jump right into the fictional pieces first because I only have two of them. The first one is Little Eyes by Samanta Schweblin and translated from the Spanish by Megan McDowell. This is a book about Kentuckys, and Kentuckys are fictional products that I imagine as kind of like a Furby that has speakers on it and it has wheels on it so it can be controlled and moved around. And there's two types of people that use Kentuckys. There's people that buy Kentuckys like at a store, and they come in these different kind of furry animal kind of shapes and variations. And the other population of people that use Kentuckys are people that control them. So when I go to the store and I buy a Kentucky, I take it home, I unpackage it, and it is being literally controlled by someone else in the world, and I don't know who. So it's a little bit of maybe Furby meets chat roulette. And this is a really interesting concept. The book is split into some very short chapters that are centered on people all across the world, and both users of Kentuckys and people who are controlling Kentuckys. And it explores the different ways that this piece of, I'm going to call it social media, how it impacts daily lives. And so there are different situations where people would want a Kentucky. You know, some people want companionship because they're lonely, they want friendship. Some people choose to exploit others. Some people are voyeurs for their viewers. And it's this really interesting deep dive into a concept that is both out there, like Kentuckys aren't real, but it almost feels like they could be, right? And that's the part that makes this book really unsettling, and some people called it almost horror-esque. I don't think I would push it that far into that category, but it definitely left me like a little bit of unease after I finished it. And for that reason, it's really sat with me. The other book that makes commentary on social media is called Aesthetica, and this is by Allie Rowbottom. This is a recent release. I think it came out, oh, it hasn't even come out. I got an advance copy from Netgalley, but it comes out at the end of this month. Now, Aesthetica is a book about an Instagram influencer, and so it makes a lot of commentary about the social media app. And it has these dual timelines, and the first timeline is set in the 2010s, and it follows this recent high school graduate who moves to LA, and she's really, as a reader, you think she's a little bit pathetic, but she really wants love, and she wants attention, and she wants validation. And in this case, she gets it through Instagram followers. And so the first section follows her relationship with herself, her relationship with other young women, with her mother, who doesn't want her to do this, and I think most interestingly, her relationship with her manager / boyfriend. I think there's some really interesting power dynamics between those two characters, and that was actually my favorite part of this book. And then a second timeline is set 20 years in the future, so maybe in the 2030s, and it follows the same woman who's a bit washed up now, and she's going in for a procedure called Aesthetica. And Aesthetica is a surgery that will basically reverse all of the previous cosmetic enhancements that she's had done. I think for being called Aesthetica, there's actually very little commentary on the procedure itself. And the problem with these dual timeline books is that if you don't like them equally, then one of the timelines becomes kind of a drag to read, and the whole pacing of the book itself kind of slows down. And I felt that here. I think that the initial timeline, the earlier timeline, was really interesting, and I liked reading that. This later timeline I felt was a little bit pointless, and so this book took me a really long time to actually get through. I think that the author, Rowbottom, really understands Instagram culture, and she makes a lot of commentary, like I said. Some of it is a little bit on the nose and kind of obvious, and there are definitely sections of this book that feel a little bit maybe overwritten. Like there's a lot of internal monologues and things like that, but I think it's really, this book is trying to cater towards I think, young women that like these kind of unlikable female characters. And I think if that's something that you're really into, then you might like this as well. I do think for me it was missing just a little bit because of the unevenness of the timelines, but it does make some very relevant commentary. Okay, everything else that I have for you is nonfiction. So I'm going to continue with these books that make some sort of social commentary by starting with So You've Been Publicly Shamed by Ronson, which, like the title suggests, goes through situations in which people have been online publicly shamed, typically for things that they have also said online. Now, my takeaway from this book, and there's one thing that you also take away from it, even if you haven't read it, is don't shoot off tweets without thinking about it. You know, basically all the situations that this author goes through is when people, you know, there was some world event and then somebody was like, oh, let me be funny, you know, let me be witty on the internet, and shot off a tweet that they just straight up just didn't think about, right? And so I think this book is readable because it's kind of fluffy. You know, Ronson doesn't go into a lot of details as to like the psychology of shame or the idea of like mob mentality. It feels very lighthearted, and Ronson even goes all the way to like make commentary on what we should think. So he'll have like an example of someone who gets, you know, publicly called out for, and then he'll be like, well, I don't really think this person should have been publicly called out for. And I'm like, you know, it's not really why I'm reading this book. I don't really care what Ronson thinks. So yeah, overall, I thought this was not worth reading. I think you've already learned the main takeaway from the book, which is don't use Twitter stupidly, if at all. And yeah, it's not worth reading. If you want a book with a little bit more meat to it, but stays within kind of this technology and psychology kind of umbrella, we have Irresistible, The Rise of Addictive Technology and the Business of Keeping Us Hooked by Adam Alter. Now, this covers why we are addicted to our phones, but it spends the majority of its time focusing on why we're addicted to like mobile phone apps or video games. I was expecting a little bit more about like social media, but I do think that a lot of the conclusions that Alter comes to are applicable to social media apps as well. You know, Alter, unlike Ronson, spends a lot of time looking at, you know, peer-reviewed, cited experiments that are diving into really the psychology of online addiction and the different elements of games in this case that make them so fun to play, but also in certain aspects kind of dangerous to play because they keep us playing for way too long. So I think that if you're interested in psychology, if you yourself play a lot of video games or you know somebody who plays a lot of video games, then yeah, this is definitely an interesting one. I think it also includes tips for stepping away from your phones and from these different games. And so it's a bit of a combination of, I'd say, technology, psychology, and self-help. But I enjoyed my time with it, and I have thought about it over time. A bit of a scathing review of big tech can be found in Don't Be Evil, How Big Tech Betrayed Its Founding Principles in All of Us by Rana Foroohar. And Don't Be Evil was an actual like phrase incorporated into Google's code of conduct. It's since been removed from that. I think they tried to do it quietly. And I think that really sets the tone for this book, where it's really focusing in on how big tech has kind of used its users and its users' data as a way to gain just crazy momentum and money in Silicon Valley. Like I said, it covers a lot of different sections. I think the first section will be most relevant to a lot of people and most familiar in some cases. The idea of surveillance capitalism, the idea that users are not customers but products, right? Like Google, we are not Google's customers. We're the product that they sell to their actual customers, which is different advertising companies. So that idea, the idea of kind of black box algorithms, the idea of privacy and privacy laws, those kind of build this first kind of third of this book. And I think, again, it would be the most familiar to people who have seen things like The Social Dilemma, which is a really great documentary on Netflix. I found that it was almost too repetitive. I think because I had watched the documentary really close to reading this, I kind of felt like I was hearing the same thing over and over again. So it wasn't as impactful as I think it would have been if somebody had not kind of come across these ideas. And then the rest of the book covers ideas like antitrust legislation. It covers how the author thinks that what banks did for the 2008 recession is what she thinks big tech will do for the next recession. It covers different ways in which we can stop big tech from being so powerful. And I think that, well, there were ideas in here that I kind of agreed with and I thought were interesting. Overall, this is a pretty dense piece of nonfiction that doesn't have like this kind of humanistic thread that pulls through it that I know I talk about all the time on this channel. But because it felt like it was just like these bit of like drier and disparate kind of subjects, there wasn't something that kind of tied them all together. I just thought it was kind of boring. Specifically like the antitrust section was just like wildly boring. So I only gave this 2 stars. I read it for a book club and nobody else in that book club liked it either. And so I would probably pass on this and watch the documentary instead. And then the last 4 books I want to talk about today have to do with specific businesses and the history of those companies. And I think maybe the first thing I'd say is that if you're not interested in the product or the company, then the book might not be as interesting for you, right? So, for example, I don't use WeWork. I don't really use Twitter, so I'm not going to read the book about the WeWork CEO or the book about Twitter because it's just not something that I'm as interested in. But I do think, you know, a lot of the books that I've talked about so far are really critical of technology itself. And yet, you know, we use technology all the time. Like I like my social media apps. I like using my phone, even though I might use it way too much. And so sometimes it's interesting and worth knowing where these companies came from and what the original vision and idea was for them. I think that is sometimes worth knowing and worth thinking about. And so on that note, I'm going to kick off with No Filter, The Inside Story of Instagram by Sarah Frier. Now, people on Instagram can be very deliberate with the things that they post on their pages. I know I myself sometimes fall into this hole as well. Because there's a certain kind of like vision persona that people want to show on the app. And I always thought that just kind of grew out of human nature maybe, but I found it really fascinating to learn that this kind of like highlight reel, this kind of only showing the beautiful aspects of your life was the original vision of the 2 founders of Instagram. And so, you know, knowing that and then seeing how Instagram has changed over the years to try and accommodate not only, you know, billions of users, but also the need for a higher revenue base and balancing that with the idea of this original vision has been really interesting to see across these pages. The author goes through the different reasons why different things were added. So why did we move away from a chronological timeline? Why did we move away from square photos? All these different things that you might have wondered, hey, why did we do that? You know, this book will try and answer. And I think it's researched really well, and the author is pretty unbiased in the way that she presents it. I thought that one of the really interesting things of this book is kind of understanding the behind the scenes dynamic between Facebook and Instagram. You know, Facebook bought Instagram for $1 billion when it was only 2 years old, and yet has kind of given Instagram quite a bit of freedom to grow. And yet Instagram is in itself like a competitor to Facebook. So I found that the dynamics between the 2 different companies really interesting. And I think that if you use the app a ton, if you want to understand, like I said, why all these different changes happen to the app over time, you want to know the behind the scenes reasons for those, and I think that you might like this. I think out of the business books that I'm going to talk about, this was one of my favorites, and I was really glad that I read it. For the person who's really into I guess the automotive industry, we have Power Play, Tesla, Elon Musk, and the Bet of the Century by Tim Higgins. I think a lot of people associate Elon Musk with Tesla because he owns it, but Musk did not start Tesla. And I think my favorite aspect of this book was really like the first quarter, the first third of it, which talked about, you know, the actual founders of Tesla and their kind of vision for an electrified future. I think Tesla is really changing the game when it comes to not only non-gasoline vehicles, but also just even the experience of buying a car. You know, you can buy it online for the same price anywhere. There's no dealership that you have to go through. And so I think if you're interested in how, you know, an electric vehicle future will change the world, I think this is a good place to start to try and understand the different challenges that come with electrifying vehicles. It does focus a little bit in on like corporate, especially once Musk enters the picture. It focuses in on like corporate dynamics and kind of power plays within the company itself, and that I think was a little bit less interesting. But if you think that this would be something that you'd like, then I did think this was pretty good. I think the book that is probably the most well-known across this video is Bad Blood, Secrets and Lies in a Silicon Valley Startup by John Carreyrou, which covers Elizabeth Holmes and Theranos, the blood testing company that made a lot of promises and a lot of claims to investors to try and get all the startup money, and it was really kind of based on a house of lies. I think one thing to note, though, about this book is that John Carreyrou, the author, is an active participant in the storyline itself. You know, he was writing some different articles, news articles about Elizabeth Holmes. She tried to prevent him from publishing those articles, and so it's not in any way an unbiased accounting of all the events that occurred around Theranos. I think Carreyrou paints himself in a pretty positive light. He paints Holmes in a pretty negative light. She may deserve that. It's just something to note. You're not reading, like I said, an unbiased accounting of the different events, but I can't deny that this is like propulsively readable. I think I just blazed through this in a day or two. The audiobook is narrated really well, and I thought it was really entertaining. I get why people like this book so much. And then lastly, I have The Everything Store, Jeff Bezos and the Age of Amazon by Brad Stone, which covers the birth of Amazon. Catch is that this is published about a decade ago, and so the content feels kind of dated. It stops before we get to the Amazon that we know like nowadays. And I think out of all of the nonfiction books that I'm talking about today, or at least the ones focusing on certain businesses, this spends so much time on office politics. It seemed like there was just like a revolving door of executives that came in, came out, came in, came out. And I didn't retain any of the names except for Jeff Bezos, which is the one name that I walked into the book with. I think, you know, if you work for Amazon, you might like this. If you want to hear kind of, you know, funny little stories about the birth, if you want to hear about it as how it was originally a book selling company, I think that part is interesting. My favorite part was they talked about the birth of the Kindle, and that is the reading medium that I use to consume like 80% of the books that I read. I hook it up to my public library, and it's my favorite way to read books. But overall, I felt like this was kind of boring. I had the audiobook, and I remember just zoning out while this was droning on. And Brad Stone has actually followed up this book with another book called Amazon Unbound, which covers things like Amazon's AWS, so the web services, you know, Prime Video, the purchase of Whole Foods, so all the things that we now associate with this, you know, superpower that is Amazon. But I don't think I'm interested enough to read it, so I'm probably going to skip on that book. But yeah, I think those were a whole bunch of books that have to do with technology. I hope you don't think that I don't like technology, because I do like technology. I just think it's really interesting to think about the impacts of technology, because it is so ubiquitous now. You know, these apps, our phones, all of these different companies that have really kind of integrated their roots into our everyday lives. Understanding like what they're trying to do in their histories, I think, is really important aspect of using this technology as well. And so I hope I've inspired you to think a little bit about the technology that you use. But yeah, if you have any recommendations for books that fall into this category, you can tell me down below. And if you like this kind of like thematic review video, you can also let me know. I think I'm having fun doing them, and I hope that people are liking them as well. And I have quite a few ideas for other subjects coming down the line. But yeah, hope you guys are doing well, and I'll see you next time. Bye.